In the early hours, a hospital can feel almost still. The lights are low. The corridors are clean and quiet. Footsteps come and go with purpose, but softly, as if the building itself is trying not to wake anyone. Behind the doors of a neonatal unit, the world is even smaller. There are incubators, monitors, charts, tiny blankets, nurses moving carefully between fragile lives. Parents sitting close, often exhausted, sometimes hopeful, sometimes afraid, waiting for the smallest signs of improvement. In a place like this, trust is not just expected, it is necessary. Parents trust the staff. Nurses trust one another. Doctors trust the records, the observations, the routines, the handovers at the end of a long shift. And for a long time, when babies at one hospital began to collapse unexpectedly, that trust remained the starting point. The first question was not criminal, it was medical. Was there an infection? Was there a hidden weakness? Was there a problem with equipment, staffing, or training? Was this a terrible cluster of fragile patients, arriving too close together in time? The answers did not come quickly. They came slowly, through charts and meetings, through quiet concern, through patterns that some staff believed could no longer be ignored. A hospital looked inward. Then, outside experts were asked to look again. Then, at last, police were called. What followed became one of the longest and most difficult murder investigations in modern British criminal history. An inquiry not built around a single scene, a single witness, or a single night, but around months of medical records, repeated collapses, and the painful question of whether harm had happened in a place meant for healing. This is the story of that investigation. Not just the headlines, not just the trial, but the long, careful path from concern to review, to police inquiry, to court, and then to the questions that continued afterward. Welcome back. Tonight, we are looking at the investigation of Lucy Letby, the former neonatal nurse convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital. This episode is written for calm, late-night listening. The subject is deeply serious, and the people at the center of it were real families, real babies, real medical staff, and real communities affected by lasting grief. We will avoid graphic detail. We will focus on what was documented, what investigators examined, what the courts heard, and what remains under review through public inquiry and criminal case processes. As of this recording, Lucy Letby's convictions remain in place. In February 2025, the Criminal Cases Review Commission confirmed that it had received an application on her behalf. The CCRC explained that it does not decide innocence or guilt, but investigates whether a case may need to return to the appellate courts. And in parallel, the Thirlwall inquiry was established to examine the events at the Countess of Chester Hospital and their wider implications following Letby's convictions. The inquiry's website stated in May 2026 that its final report would not be published until after the summer recess of Parliament. So tonight's story is not a mystery in the ordinary sense. It is a story about detection in a medical setting, a story about how warnings were raised, a story about how a pattern was built, and a story about why, even after verdicts were reached, the wider search for understanding continued. The Countess of Chester Hospital is in Chester, in northwest England. Within the hospital was a neonatal unit, a specialist place for babies who needed extra care after birth. Some were premature, some were recovering from difficult deliveries. Some needed breathing support, feeding help, careful monitoring, or time to grow stronger before going home. Neonatal units are highly structured environments. They depend on teams: doctors, nurses, consultants, junior staff, managers, and specialists all work in close contact. Notes are written, observations are recorded, shifts change. Babies are moved between rooms depending on the level of care required. The work can be emotionally intense, but also deeply routine. A nurse might check a line, record a feed, comfort parents, respond to an alarm, and prepare for handover, all within a short span of time. In this world, Lucy Letby was a neonatal nurse. She had trained at the University of Chester and worked at the Countess of Chester Hospital. By the time concerns began to grow, she was part of the unit's regular staff. To many, she appeared ordinary. Colleagues knew her as a trained nurse. Families encountered her in the setting where they were most vulnerable. She was someone who wore the uniform, followed the rota, and worked within a team. That ordinary appearance became one of the most unsettling parts of the case, because the allegations that later emerged were not about someone forcing their way into a hospital. They were about someone already inside the system. But before police became involved, there were months of uncertainty. Between June 2015 and June 2016, the neonatal unit experienced a series of deaths and serious collapses among babies. Some babies died, others survived after sudden episodes that staff found difficult to explain. At first, these events were treated as clinical emergencies. That matters. When a baby becomes unwell in a neonatal unit, the first response is care. Staff act quickly. They call for help. They try to stabilize the baby. They document what happened as best they can. Only later, sometimes much later, can people step back and ask whether the pattern makes sense. In this case, some consultants became concerned that the number of incidents was unusual. They also became concerned about whether particular staff members were present during repeated events. The hospital environment made the investigation especially complex. Unlike many criminal cases, there was no single moment when everything became obvious. There was no public crime scene in the usual sense. The evidence was scattered across medical charts, staffing rotas, text messages, handover sheets, witness memories, expert reports, and hospital management records. The investigation had to move backward through time. It had to ask what happened on many separate shifts. It had to examine whether the baby's conditions could be explained by natural causes: prematurity, infection, medical complication, or care problems. And it had to do this with care, because the consequences of getting it wrong were enormous. For the families, the question was devastating. For the hospital, it was institutionally painful. For the police, it was unlike most inquiries. And for the courts, it would eventually become a long, detailed case involving medical experts, nurses, doctors, records, and weeks of testimony. The crimes for which Lucy Letby was convicted took place between June 2015 and June 2016, while she was working in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The babies were anonymized in court and referred to by letters. This was done to protect their identities and the privacy of their families. In August 2023, after an 8-month trial at Manchester Crown Court, Letby was convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others. She was given whole life terms. In July 2024, after a retrial, she was convicted of attempting to murder another baby, known as Baby K. For the purpose of this script, we will not dwell on the physical details of the incidents. What matters for understanding the investigation is the pattern alleged and then accepted by the juries. The prosecution case was that babies in the unit had suffered sudden, unexpected collapses, and that Lucy Letby had been present in connection with many of them. The court heard evidence about clinical deterioration, medical observations, staffing patterns, and events that doctors and nurses said they struggled to explain at the time. Some babies had seemed stable or improving before becoming critically unwell. In some cases, the prosecution relied on expert interpretation of medical signs and test results. In others, it relied on witness evidence, records, timing, and Letby's presence. The case was not simple. It was layered. Each baby's case had to be considered separately. But the prosecution also asked the jury to look at the wider picture. That wider picture became central to the investigation. Because in a hospital, one unexplained event may be tragic, two may be alarming, several, across months, begin to raise a different kind of question. During the trial, Letby denied harming any baby. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense argued that the baby's collapses and deaths could be explained by other factors, including medical conditions, shortcomings in care, pressures within the unit, and the complexity of neonatal medicine. This is important to state clearly. The investigation did not begin with a confession. It did not begin with a simple admission. It was built from disputed medical evidence, witness accounts, documents, and patterns. The jury ultimately accepted the prosecution case in multiple counts, but the route to those verdicts had taken years. It began not in court, but inside a hospital unit, where staff were trying to understand why so many terrible things had happened so close together. The investigation into Lucy Letby is best understood in stages. First came concern, then internal review, then external medical scrutiny, then police involvement, then arrest, further review, charging, trial, retrial, appeal attempts, and later public inquiry. Each stage changed the shape of the case. In the beginning, staff at the Countess of Chester Hospital were responding to events as medical emergencies. Babies became unwell. Doctors and nurses acted. Families were informed. Notes were made. But as the number of deaths and collapses increased, some consultants became troubled by what they were seeing. The concern was not only that babies had died or deteriorated, it was that some of the incidents seemed unexpected, and there appeared to be recurring circumstances around them. When clinicians reviewed the cases, they looked for ordinary explanations first. In neonatal care, ordinary does not mean simple. Babies can be extremely fragile. Prematurity, infection, respiratory problems, feeding issues, and other medical complications can all create sudden emergencies. So the early question was not, who did this? It was, what is happening? That distinction is central. A hospital cannot leap to a criminal conclusion without evidence. It has to examine clinical explanations. It has to review staffing, procedures, equipment, infection control, and the baby's individual medical conditions. Over time, concerns about Letby's presence during incidents became part of the discussion. According to later public reporting and court evidence, consultants raised worries. Meetings took place. The matter moved through hospital channels. There were disagreements, delays, and difficult conversations. Eventually, the hospital contacted police. In May 2017, Cheshire Constabulary began what became known as Operation Hummingbird. The police were entering an unfamiliar landscape. Most murder investigations begin with a body, a location, and a suspected event. This one began with a neonatal unit, medical uncertainty, and a group of cases spread across time. Detectives had to understand not only possible crime, but medicine. They needed expert help. They needed to know whether the baby's collapses could be explained naturally. They needed to know whether care had fallen short. They needed to know whether the records pointed toward deliberate harm or toward something else. Police collected medical notes, staffing records, shift data, and witness statements. They spoke to doctors, nurses, managers, and families. They examined where Letby had been working and when. They reviewed the cases of babies who had died and babies who had collapsed but survived. And they looked at the bigger question. Was there a pattern that could not reasonably be explained by chance or medical complexity alone? This phase was painstaking. It was not dramatic in the usual true crime sense. It was quiet, repetitive, document-heavy work. A detective might spend hours on a timeline. An expert might review a chart, line by line. A witness might be asked to remember a shift from years earlier. A family might have to revisit the worst moments of their lives. The investigation also had to preserve fairness. When police investigate a professional setting, especially a hospital, they must be cautious. A bad outcome is not automatically a crime. A mistake is not automatically intentional. A cluster of deaths may have multiple possible explanations. So Operation Hummingbird had to test competing possibilities. Could there have been infection? Could the unit have been under pressure? Could medical records have been incomplete? Could a baby's condition have been more fragile than it appeared? Could multiple independent tragedies have occurred close together? Or was there evidence of deliberate harm? The police brought in medical experts to review cases. This became one of the most important and later most debated parts of the investigation. Expert evidence helped shape the prosecution case. Experts looked at the clinical records and gave opinions on whether collapses were natural, unexplained, or suspicious. In a medical case, expert opinion does not replace the jury, but it can help the jury understand what the records mean. The expert's role was to translate complex neonatal events into evidence that could be weighed in court. At the same time, police examined non-medical material. They looked at Letby's communications. They looked at items found in her home. They looked at handover sheets and notes. They looked at her work patterns. They considered what she said in interviews. During the investigation, Letby was arrested more than once before being charged. Her first arrest was in July 2018. That moment marked a public turning point, but not the end of the inquiry. In complex cases, arrest can be part of evidence gathering. It allows police to interview a suspect, search property, and seize material. But it does not mean charges are immediate. The investigation continued. Letby was later arrested again, and in November 2020 she was charged. By then, the case file had become enormous. It involved many babies, many alleged incidents, years of records, and large amounts of expert and witness evidence. The trial opened at Manchester Crown Court in October 2022. For the families, the process had already taken years. For jurors, it meant entering a long and difficult body of evidence. For the prosecution, the task was to prove each count beyond reasonable doubt. For the defense, the task was to challenge the interpretation of the evidence, the reliability of the prosecution case, and the idea that Letby had deliberately caused harm. The trial lasted many months. The court heard from medical staff, expert witnesses, and others connected to the hospital and investigation. The babies were identified only by letters. The evidence was detailed and emotionally heavy. In August 2023, Letby was convicted on multiple counts. The jury found her guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others. On some counts, the jury did not reach verdicts. One of those unresolved counts concerned baby K. That count later went to a retrial. In July 2024, a second jury convicted Letby of attempting to murder baby K. The CPS said this followed the earlier jury's inability to reach a verdict on that count in 2023. After the convictions, the investigation did not simply vanish. In fact, the case widened. There were questions about how concerns had been handled inside the hospital. There were questions about whether management responded appropriately. There were questions about whether earlier action might have prevented harm. And there were questions about whether other cases needed review. The public inquiry, chaired by Lady Justice Thirlwall, was established to examine events at the Countess of Chester Hospital and their implications following Letby's convictions. The inquiry is not a criminal trial. It does not decide guilt or innocence. Its purpose is broader. It looks at systems, decisions, warnings, culture, management, and lessons for the future. In a case like this, that distinction matters. A criminal trial asks whether a defendant committed specific offenses. A public inquiry asks how a system responded, what failed, what worked, and what should change. The Thirlwall inquiry heard evidence and submissions, and its website later stated that the evidence and submissions phase had drawn to a close. Its May 2026 update said the final report would not be published until after the summer recess of Parliament. Meanwhile, another layer developed. Questions and criticisms about the convictions became public. Some medical experts and commentators challenged aspects of the prosecution evidence. Letby's legal team made an application to the CCRC, arguing that her convictions should be reviewed. The CCRC confirmed in February 2025 that it had received a preliminary application. It also stressed that it is not for the CCRC to determine innocence or guilt. That remains a matter for the courts. The CCRC's role is to investigate whether new evidence or new argument creates a real possibility that a conviction would not be upheld. That process, too, is part of the wider story. Because the investigation of Lucy Letby did not end at conviction, the criminal verdicts remain. The families continue to live with what happened. The hospital and health system continue to be examined, and the case continues to be discussed, debated, and reviewed through official channels. In January 2026, Cheshire Constabulary said the CPS would not bring further charges against Letby after reviewing evidence files submitted in July 2025, relating to 9 babies. The police said the decision did not affect or undermine the existing convictions, which followed 2 criminal trials and unsuccessful appeals. That update shows how large the investigation had become. Even after the trials, police had continued reviewing other matters, but a charging decision is not the same as suspicion, and suspicion is not the same as proof. Prosecutors must decide whether evidence meets the legal test for charges. In that further review, the CPS did not bring additional charges. For investigators, this was another boundary. For families, it was another difficult moment. For the public, it was a reminder that this case sits at the intersection of grief, medicine, law, and uncertainty. To understand the investigation, we have to understand how unusual it was. It was not built around one event. It was built around many. It was not built from one kind of evidence. It was built from medical records, expert interpretation, staffing data, communications, witness accounts, and the slow accumulation of concern. It asked jurors to consider both individual cases and a wider pattern. It required detectives to learn the language of neonatal care. It required doctors to revisit their own assumptions. It required families to place their private grief into public proceedings. And it required the justice system to handle one of the most sensitive criminal cases imaginable. This case is not unsolved in the legal sense. Lucy Letby has been convicted. Her convictions remain in place, but the case still raises questions, and those questions are part of the investigation's legacy. Some questions are about the hospital. Why were concerns not resolved sooner? How were warnings handled? What did managers know, and when? Were doctors listened to? Were families given the information they needed? Could systems have responded differently? These are the kinds of questions the Thirlwall inquiry was created to examine. They are not abstract. In a hospital, communication is safety. If a concern is raised, the way it is recorded, escalated, challenged, or dismissed can shape what happens next. The inquiry's purpose is to understand those pathways. Other questions are about medical evidence. Neonatal medicine is complex. Babies in intensive care can deteriorate for reasons that are difficult to identify, even with careful review. That complexity is one reason the police relied heavily on expert interpretation. It is also one reason the case has continued to attract debate. The CCRC application reflects that continuing challenge, but again, the CCRC does not decide guilt or innocence. It assesses whether there is a basis to refer a case back to the Court of Appeal. Then there are questions about public discussion. This case has generated intense commentary. Some people focus on the verdicts and the evidence accepted by the juries. Others focus on expert criticism, institutional failures, or the possibility of error. In March 2025, Reuters reported that the chair of the public inquiry rejected calls to pause the inquiry while the CCRC review was considered. The report quoted the inquiry chair as saying, The inquiry did not become unfair simply because it was asserted that convictions were unsafe. That decision shows the tension at the heart of the case. There is the criminal process, there is the public inquiry, there is public debate, and there are families who should not be forgotten within any of it. For a sleep-friendly true crime telling, it is important not to turn the case into a puzzle detached from human life. The babies were not symbols. The families are not footnotes. The staff who raised concerns. The staff who were questioned. The experts. The investigators. And the wider hospital community all became part of a story that changed many lives. A responsible telling has to hold two ideas at once. First, the legal reality. Lucy Letby was convicted by juries after lengthy trials, and those convictions remain in force. Second, the continuing reality. Official reviews and inquiries have continued to examine the case, the hospital response, and the wider system around it. Those two ideas do not cancel each other out. They show the different purposes of different processes. A jury decides charges. An appeal court reviews legal safety. The CCRC examines possible miscarriages of justice. A public inquiry examines institutional lessons. Police and prosecutors consider whether further charges meet the legal threshold. Each has its own role. Each moves at its own pace. And each leaves a record behind. The investigation of Lucy Letby began with something no hospital ever wants to face. A pattern, not a clear answer, not a single moment of certainty. A pattern, a series of collapses, a series of deaths, a series of questions that became harder to set aside. At first, those questions belonged to doctors and nurses. Then they moved to managers, then to external reviewers, then to police, then to prosecutors, then to jurors, then to appeal judges, inquiry, lawyers, public officials, and review bodies. But before all of that, they belonged to families sitting beside incubators, hoping their babies would come home. The investigation was long because the truth was not easy to reach. It was long because the setting was medical. It was long because the evidence was complicated. It was long because the consequences were profound. And even now, after convictions, after sentencing, after appeals, after a retrial, and after further official review, the story remains heavy with unanswered institutional questions. How did this happen in a place built for care? How did concerns travel through the system? Where did communication fail? What should be changed so that warnings are heard sooner? Those are quiet questions, but they are not small ones. They matter because hospitals depend on trust. They matter because parents entering neonatal units are handing over the most fragile part of their lives. They matter because staff need systems that protect patients and support those who raise concerns. And they matter because the measure of an investigation is not only whether it reaches a verdict, it is whether it leaves behind enough understanding to prevent future harm. The Countess of Chester case will be studied for years by police, by lawyers, by doctors, by nurses, by hospital managers, by people who work in patient safety, and by families who know, more than anyone, that behind every document and every timeline was a child who was loved. Tonight, the hospital corridors are quiet again. The lights are low. The machines hum softly. The records are filed. The courtrooms are still, but the questions remain in the air, asking to be handled carefully, not loudly, not sensationally, carefully, because this was never only a case about what happened. It was also a case about who noticed, who listened, who acted, and what must never be missed again. Thank you for listening. This episode was written with care for calm, nighttime listening, with respect for the families affected, and for the seriousness of the case. If you continue with the channel, may the next story meet you in the same quiet place, steady, thoughtful, and gentle enough for the end of the day. Sleep well.